Mr. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, sad to admit, previous efforts on war and terror has ended as a dismal failure. Taliban has flourished within Afghanistan. ISIS has prospered within Syria. Pakistan has literally been abused as Bin Laden as his own safe haven. Therefore, we believe that the metric in order to judge this debate is very, very simple. We believe that it's simply about who better fulfills the goals of the war on terror. So, what are the goals of war on terror itself? Three things. Number one, legitimacy. Number two, guaranteeing effectiveness. And number three, guaranteeing a long term solvency of the issue. So, three questions that side proposition is going to tell you, is going to ask in order to prove that we fulfill these three things. Number one, which side is much more legitimate? So basically, the issues of sovereignty. Number two, which side is more effective? And finally, number three, do we actually undermine international law? So on to our first clash regarding sovereignty, about whether this is a legitimate decision to make. We gave you about a spectrum of nations. We told that various nations exist within the status quo. The one-line response the side opposition gives us is two things. Number one, that these actors are not legitimate because they are not directly influenced by the decisions that they make. And secondly, about the issues of effectiveness, which I'm also going to talk about in my second clash. But firstly, let's talk about the actors. Panel, we have to recognize the fact that this debate runs on a comparative. There's no such thing as a 100% effective actor, nor is there something as a 100% accountable actor in the first place. We believe that it is not a situation where you have to choose between an excellent actor and a bad actor, rather it is a comparative in which we decide which one is more better. So what is the actor that side proposition can bring to the table? It is the West, it is nations such as USA, it is the nations that are openly dedicated to combating terrorism, the nations that want to have a long history of tackling terrorism and also have a reputation of taking down these organizations multilaterally. What is the actors that side operation can bring to us? It is the individual nation states. It is nations like Pakistan. It is nations like Iran. They're openly dedicated to supporting these terrorist organizations in the first place. That's why under their side, their actors are much worse. Even though we have all the harms that side operation tells us under our world, the problem is, Mr. Madam Speaker, is that the actors that side operation wants to talk about are the nations that are openly endorsing terrorism in the first place. Then, side opposition asks us to talk about the better states like Zimbabwe, that those states, the kind of states that want to combat terrorism but simply do not have the capacity to do so. Mr. Madam Speaker, we don't think that this debate operates under such a world. We think that if nation states are already willing to combat terrorism but simply a matter of capacity, we don't think that there's an incentive for those nation states to reject US from intervening. There isn't an incentive for nations to reject such Western nations from intervening within their own lands in the first place. However, therefore, the actors that you want to talk in this debate, the grounds and the background that you want to talk in this debate are the countries like Pakistan, the countries like Iran, where they do not consent and we need this motion in order to actively tackle terrorism. But secondly, let's assume in their best case scenario and let's say that somehow these countries like Zimbabwe somehow do not want Western nations to come into their country, to come into their grounds. Okay, Mr. Madam Speaker, it's great if those nations that can combat terrorism by themselves. But the problem is, Mr. Madam Speaker, that those nations' incapability to combat terrorism is causing a global threat to the world, Mr. Madam Speaker. It is great if you can combat terrorism by yourself, but the problem is your incapability is putting my own citizens at risk, is putting your neighboring country's citizens at risk. We already justify things like self-defense. We already justify things like mutually assured destruction, because if your own citizens are at risk, the first thing that you need to prioritize is your own national security, Mr. Madam Speaker. That is the reason why, even under countries like Zimbabwe, it is still justified to go into these nations without consent. Because in these same lines as we justify self-defense, when push comes to shove, we have to sacrifice sovereignty at the end of the day. So secondly, let's talk about effectiveness. What are the alternatives the side opposition can give us? Okay, Mr. Madam Speaker, the two mechanisms the side opposition gives us. Number one, they talk about economic support. And then they also talk about economic sanctions and military combats within those regions. This gets very, very strange because you can't have economic support and military combats and economic sanctions at the first place. So you have to choose either between economic supports or very, very hardline stances like economic sanctions. So let's first talk about economic support. What happens on the economic support, Mr. Madam Speaker? The money is literally usurped by these terrorist organizations because the countries that these terrorist organizations are the most rampant are the countries where they have already control over the local municipalities. So even in an instance where we can funnel money into those nations, we cannot guarantee that the money is going to be trickling down to the people. Rather, it's very, very likely that the terrorist organizations use it for their own benefits. So if we send such economic support to those nations, if we send charity, it comes back to us as bombs, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why economic support is never something that we want to do in this debate. Second, let's talk about their hardline stance, economic sanctions and military competence. Okay, but the problem is that side opposition told us that if you're going to have like military competence, you're going to have increased resentments toward the US. So this is a clear contradiction of the side opposition. If you're going to have military combats, then you're also going to have the massive resentments towards US on the your side as well. This is why their side simply has a contradiction. Rather, what's the mechanism that side proposition gives to you in this debate? We think that there's mainly two scenarios in which that happens to these terrorist organizations when these operations to decapitate the organizations are successful. Number one, when the organizations fragment. We believe that this is very, very beneficial for us. The one-line response coming from side opposition is that the fragmented groups are somehow going to be more radical. Okay, let's assume in the instances where they actually become more radical. But the problem is, this is actually good for us, because when you have a more radical group, these radical groups are open to more attacks. More nations in the West, more organizations are actually openly dedicated to tackling down and taking down these radical groups. The more organizations become radical, the more enemies that it has. Number two, the more radical an organization becomes, you actually increase the bar to join that organization as a whole. So within the religious community or within your neighboring countries, less people want to join your group the more you actually become radical, because you increase the bar in order to join that group as well. So that's why, if you think about the radical groups that exist within our society, they oftentimes dissolve by themselves without actually us tackling them, without us actually actively taking them down, Mr. Madam Speaker. So even though you have radical groups, we know that's actually good for us. Number two, the instances where you have a smooth transition, those instances where side operation so much emphasizes. Okay, let's assume that a smooth transition happens after decapitation of that terrorist organization. This is still good in mainly two ways. Number one, even though you have a smooth transition, you're definitely going to have a leader that has less experience running that organization. What does this mean? Until that leader becomes much more accustomed to running that organization and gains more experience, we earn time. We earn time in order to prepare ourselves for further attacks. We earn time in order for us to have things like joint military combats and having more preparations before they actually engage attacks upon us. Number two, if you have a smooth transition, that means that the second leader is going to hide himself because he simply doesn't want to get killed, right? But then the problem is, Mr. Madam Speaker, from the moment when a leader tries to hide himself, it means that you have to divert resources to hide yourself. The fact that you need to maintain those safe havens from the West means that you're using more military competence. It means that you're using more resources in order to hide yourself from those military operations. The more you invest in hiding yourself and the more you divert resources, the less the capability of the terrorist organization in launching attacks against the West become. Therefore, will lead to less casualties. Therefore, even in a smooth transition, it is beneficial for side proposition. We also told you about how there's a long-term support that's very, very likely to exist in the side propositions world as well. We can see that not all governments are crazy. We think that after the US or such Western nations come in and take away these and cripple down these terrorist organizations, then we actually allow a start to these governments to actually function properly, Mr. Madam Speaker. Many governments want to function properly. The problem is that their terrorist organizations are simply too strong and they cannot start their own process. When you first go in there and take down the terrorist organizations, the only thing that these governments have to do is to maintain that effort. Maintaining effort is much more easier than starting that effort, Mr. Madam Speaker. So you allow better stability within the region, long-term stability within the region as well. So on to our final clash regarding does this undermine international law? Okay, let's talk about international law, Mr. Madam Speaker. They said that we are undermining it and also is somehow going to lead to more escalation of conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe that international law is not supposed to be stagnant. Rather, it is supposed to be flexible, and we're exactly doing that. Because terrorism has evolved and terrorism has changed, because terrorism has exploited the rules that we have made, we should also change our rules so that terrorism cannot exploit our rules, Mr. Madam Speaker, so that we evolve according to changing terrorism. In history, when the League of Nations was first made, we need a unanimous vote to act upon it, to have military interventions. People realized that it was very, very ineffective, and therefore we changed the Security Council so that we need a two-thirds majority vote instead of a unanimous vote. After the Rwanda genocide, people also realized that that also is simply ineffective, and then we made the R2P8 conventions. We believe that all of these international laws need to evolve according to changing circumstances. We are the ones that are exactly doing that. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose a vote for side proposition. Thank you.